Shalom and greetings, friends. Thank you for clicking on this video message titled The Orthodox Jewish Calendar. And this topic is for those who are keeping the annual holy days, the Shabbats, the annual ones, the festivals, the feast days. And whether you're Orthodox, Jewish, rabbinical, secular, or even if you're a Messianic, Hebrew roots, or Christian out there, keeping the annual holy days that we find in the Scriptures. Because most, even up to today, believe that the Orthodox Jewish calendar is the same calendar that Moshe, or Moses, and the Israelites went by. That it's the same exact calendar as of the first century believers and the Sanhedrin, and that was being done before 70 A.D. when the temple was destroyed. And so if you do, I know you're sincere. Most of you are sincere. You don't know about how the calendar from the 4th century on to the 10th, the 12th century, the Jewish calendar, the rabbinical Orthodox Jewish calendar, went through an evolutionary process of little changes. It's still far more closer to the Creator's calendar than what we find in the Gregorian calendar, any man-made calendar today. But this calendar, and I hope you'll listen to me and not be offended, because all my history that has been credible to me, to prove to me of what I'm saying is true, the scholarly history, comes from the rabbinical Jewish leaders, the sages themselves. Because over the last 2,000 years, the Jewish people have kept very good records. You know, that not only do we have the Mishnah, the Talmud, we have Josephus, and we have other credible historians that understood the calendar, even Philo. Even though they were Hellenized, some of them, they understood the calendar, and in the 1st century they were practicing the same calendar, and any differences that they had, they recorded. We can find even just the way of counting the Omer was done at least 3 different ways by 3 credible sects of Judaism. The scribes and the Pharisees counted from the first day of unleavened bread, Shabbat, while the Sadducees were counting, the Bethusians, those who became the Bethusian Sadducees, at least were going by the first Shabbat during the days of unleavened bread, counting the Omer after that. And then there was the Qumran community, who was following after the first weekly Shabbat after the 7 days of unleavened bread, were counting their 50 days, and there was 3 different ways, and we can find this in history. Over the last 2,000 years, mankind has been a lot more effective in preserving history, and there's some people who say that the Jewish people have changed the weekly Shabbats, and that the Saturday, and they call themselves the lunar Sabbath people, and they count from the first new moon. Every new moon they start counting their Shabbats, and they claim that somehow the adversaries deceived all the Jewish people. Well, if we believe the 1st century, our Messiah followed the example of the temple, the holy days, he kept them when they kept them, we can see that what was good enough for our 1st century faithful followers should be good enough for us. But we can see that in history, the Jewish people admit to changing other aspects of the calendar that affect the annual Shabbats. Not the weekly Shabbats, but the annual ones. And so, like I said, I go to their own writings. Just as the Catholics admit to changing the weekly Shabbats and claim to have the authority to do so, and even quote Scripture in Matthew 18 that whatever is bound on earth by the leaders is bound up in heaven, and so they claim to have that authority to even change the Shabbats. Well, even the rabbinical Jewish people have claimed to have authority to change the calendar here and there a little bit. And it became a mathematical calendar. It wasn't based upon the lights in the firmament so much, although mathematically trying to calculate close to what can be done. So in the 4th century, around 500, or say 358, 359 AD, or CE, Christian era, however you want to word that, it was over 300 years past, or about 300 years past the destruction of the temple. We have the leading patriarch Hillel at that time, Hillel II, not Hillel I, who was in the 1st century and was a very respected, honorable rabbinical leader, but Hillel II was a brilliant mathematician and came up with a brilliant mathematical formula because, and most likely under good intentions, we must admit, that the Sanhedrin was falling apart because the Roman Empire was falling apart. The Roman Empire at least gave the Jewish people, all the way going back as far as the treaty, the Roman Maccabean Treaty of 167 BC, or BCE, however you want to word that, right around there, that treaty allowed the temple of the 1st century to continue. Although it was destroyed in 70 AD, the Jewish people still had more freedom than they would get outside the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire was falling apart in the 4th century, they could see the handwriting on the wall that they need to come up with some kind of a mathematical formula as a backup plan in case the Sanhedrin is no longer in effect and they cannot determine based upon the scriptures. And I have video teachings on just his calendar, the Creator's calendar, that you can see on our website, or you can search it through the YouTube teachings. It's called the Creator's New Year Calendar, or Creator. You can see that also, the Creators, on our website. You go to our free articles, and I have a booklet. I also have video teachings on our free video messages. And just go to www.torah, T-O-R-A-H, truth, seekers, with an S, seekers.org, not .com, but .org, O-R-G. And so, but this one I wanted to get into just the changes of the Orthodox Jewish calendar, the evolutionary changes through which took a few centuries. I'm not saying Hillel II did it all himself, but according to the Encyclopedia Judaica, 1971, Jerusalem, Israel, Volume 5. You can turn under the topic of calendars, calendar. And page 48, and also on page 50, you'll see that the modern Jewish calendar is not exactly the way it was. And since 358, it talks about Hillel II, and so I have a lot of information on that, like I said, on my booklets and on my documents. And so I'm not going to quote all the sources, but just get to the changes. What changes took place? And are they important changes? And do they have authority to make those changes? As a lot of people claim they do. What we need to realize, first of all, is we who are following Torah, whether we're Jewish or we're not, we need to do it because we want to be in alignment with Him. We're not trying to earn our salvation. We're not trying to work our way into it, but we know that we fall short and that we do need grace, and we don't have the sacrificial system, the physical one, and so we look to a spiritual sacrifice that is continual, and that He forgives us based upon, our repentant attitude and our desire to teshuvah, to return to Him, physically, spiritually, in any way He inspires us to do so. He wants us to do so, and if we drop the ball, if we put things on the shelf that He wants us to know, and so maybe this Orthodox mathematical calendar was good during past centuries when people didn't have the Bible in their native tongue. It wasn't in English until the 15th century, 16th century, and as it continued. And so if you didn't know the original Hebrew, how could you understand the Creator's calendar from the Scriptures? Or even having the Latin, in the original, in the Greek that was preserved by the Gentile Christians over the centuries, or even the Shem Tov version of Matthew. Now, the book of Matthew was preserved in Hebrew all these centuries. And so we didn't have access, but now we're living in the end times. We are living in the end times, a time of restoration of all things. And even we are prophesied. We have been prophesied to us through the book of Malachi, chapter 4, verses 5 through 6, that there will be an end-time Elijah, and he will restore all things. And let's go to those scriptures. Let's see here. In Malachi, it says, "Behold, I send you Elijah." And that's how we say it in English. "Before the coming and dreadful day of the Creator." And those of us who know or studied the topic of the day of the Lord, or the day of Adonai, or our Creator, Yehovah, Yahweh, however you want to say his name or pronounce his name or use any title for his name, it says here that before this coming and grateful day, he will return. It says he sends us Elijah the prophet. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. Now, as we turn to the Brit Hadashah scriptures, we see that this end-time Elijah is even prophesied by the Messiah. A lot of people thought Yeshua, and some of you know his Greek name is Jesus. Many people thought he was the Elijah, but he says that in John chapter 1 and verse 21, he says he's not the Elijah. He's not that Elijah, that end-time Elijah. That Elijah prepares the way of the coming of the Lord. And so we see that in Luke chapter 1 and verse 17, that, quoting back, if we go to Luke, let's see here. Luke 1 and verse 17. A lot of pages here in Luke. "He also will go before him in the spirit and the power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers," here's quoting Malachi, "of the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for Yehovah." And so he is to be preparing the way of the Lord, the Creator, and his Son. Yeshua points out that John the Baptist was a type of Elijah because he prepared the way of the coming of him, his first coming. But he also says that even John the Baptist was not that Elijah to come. As we turn to Matthew, or as we say in Hebrew, Mattiyahu 17. And in verse 11, Then the Messiah answered and said to them, Elijah truly is coming, or is coming first. Because, they said, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? So Messiah says he will come first and will restore all things. So he's going to restore. He's going to be a restoration of things that have been lost, things that have been hidden, things that humanity has forgotten, through the centuries, and it's going to be restored. And there's going to be evidence in the scriptures, of course, and even in history, as I point out. But I say to you, he talks about how this John the Baptist was an Elijah. But like I said over in John chapter 125, he says that he isn't really that Elijah that's coming at the end. So we need to understand that now is a time where we are held more accountable than in centuries past. We have more information access to us. And if we just drop the ball or put it on the shelf when he expects us to restore it, well, he's going to go to somebody else and do it through them. So if you're an Orthodox Jew, I love you. And, as the Apostle Shaul said, the gospel is for the Jews first, and then also for the Gentiles. But you Jewish people know the Torah. You know the holy language better than we Gentiles, generally speaking. And so he can use you more powerfully, more effectively, to teach the gospel. The gospel is for the Hebrew-speaking people, because as in Hebrews, we see in the book of Hebrews, in a Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant writings, in chapter 4, the same gospel was preached to Israel, and now it's given to the Gentiles. And so the apostle, in the same writer in Romans chapter 11, Romans 11:11, he says, and he's quoting Deuteronomy. Let's go back to Deuteronomy first, the scriptures that are being quoted here. Chapter 32, verse 21. You probably know it by heart. And for those of you who have not, here it goes. And it says, our Creator, they have provoked me, this is our Creator speaking to Israel, to jealousy by what is not me. They have provoked me to anger by their foolish idols, idolatry, or putting anything above Him, anything above His Word. But I will provoke them to jealousy by those who are not a nation. I will move them to anger by a foolish people, or a foolish nation. So, if you are not willing to go forward and preach truth and bring righteousness to people when it's been given to you, especially, and here I'm talking about the calendar. Let's restore this ancient Israeli, the calendar that our Creator shared with His firstborn son, Israel, as he says in Deuteronomy as well. But let's turn to the Brit Hadashah, because Paul mentions this in Romans 11:11. He says, I say then, have they, referring to Israel, stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. So, he prefers to use the Jewish people, the Israeli people, his firstborn son, to bring the gospel, to bring the Messiah to the nations. And he will use Gentiles also. And even if we Christians aren't going to do it, he'll raise up stones. If you're part of a big Christian organization or Messianic organization, and you just want to follow the Orthodox Jewish calendar for the sake of unity, for the sake of what makes it easy and convenient for you, then you reject knowledge, he will reject you, your work, your ministry, division, things will dwindle. He will allow things to happen that you won't want to happen. But he will use little people like me. He will raise stones if he has to from the ground. But he'd much rather use us humans. Those who are zealously, passionately willing to do what he says regardless of the consequences. And so he will provoke you to jealousy, even you Christians and Gentiles who are dropping the ball or putting things on the shelf that you shouldn't be putting on the shelf. Let's turn back to Acts, where we also see this in the book of Acts, chapter 13, in verse 46. It says, then Shaul, or most of you know him as Paul, And Barnabas grew bold and said, "It was necessary that the word of our Creator should be spoken to you first." Speaking to the Jewish people, the Israeli people. "But since you reject it, and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, behold, we turn to the Gentiles. For so the Lord has spoken to us," and he's quoting Isaiah here, "I have set you to be a light to the Gentiles, that you should be for salvation to the ends of the earth." So he's quoting Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6, and also a double witness in chapter 49, verse 6. That he will turn even to the Gentiles, and even in Romans chapter 10, verse 19, Paul says a similar thing there. So if we are a big organization, a big megachurch, or established Orthodox Jewish synagogue, and we are going to drop the ball on something that he's trying to get us to roll with it and do something with it, well, if we don't, he's going to go to somebody else. And so, I am not some kind of a big leader. I'm not, highly educated. I don't have any doctorate's degree or rabbi's degree or anything like that. I don't come from a prestigious background in any way, but he will use me if those who are greater than me won't do it. And he is using a lot of greater people than myself. I'm just another one of them out there trying to do the best I can. So whether you are Christian or Messianic or Hebrew roots or Jewish people, let's dig into this Jewish calendar, this Orthodox Jewish calendar, and let's understand how this calendar has changed, and why has it changed, and when has it changed, and what exactly has changed. A lot of things to look at here, but first of all, not many. I'm going to go to three important key clear points that even the Jewish people admit. You can find this in the Mishnah, the Talmud, and even in Jewish quarterly reviews in our 20th century, and in my book, I've got a whole chapter on the Hebrew history, Hebrew calendar history, from the Hebrews, from the Jewish people themselves, primarily. But one is Rosh Hashanah. And first of all, just the name also has changed. In Hebrew, it means head of the year. It's the first day of the 7th month. Now, there's got to be at least 12 months in a year, so it's not the end of a year. It's not a really, truly new year. So they've segregated an agricultural year from their civil year, and then there's, so they've separated the calendars a little bit in that regard. But it was simply to be the end of an agricultural year, yes. But Rosh Hashanah is a name that has been added later on. The Hebrew word for the holy day is Yom, day. Teruah. Teruah is trumpets. It's the feast or the day of trumpets. And that's the first day of the 7th month. But they added postponement rules since the 4th century. Now, what they call Rosh Hashanah cannot be on a Sunday, a Wednesday, or a Friday. But it can only land on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, or a Saturday, or Shabbat, a weekly Shabbat. So the attempt was to avoid certain 48-hour Shabbats. You have the weekly Shabbat, and so there's also Yom Kippur, or we call the Day of Atonement. Is not good to have a 48-hour Shabbat. That became inconvenient. By the 4th century, they said, well, we're so strict in how we're going to keep the Shabbats. We've got so many do's and don'ts that we've added. We've got the oral law that's way stricter than the written law, the written Torah. And so they had to have, they didn't like these 48-hour Shabbats. And so, our Creator says to do it this way. Well, we tend to think that we know better, and we want to do better than what we see in the written word. But in the Mishnah, which was completed in the 2nd century, by the end of the 2nd century, we see that Rosh Hashanah is landing on a Sunday. If you go to, for those of you who have the Talmud or the Mishnah, go to the Mishnah, you'll see in the book of Shabbath, Shabbath, if you're spelling it in English, chapter 19 and verse 5, you will see that even up to the 2nd century, the Orthodox rabbinical leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, the sages of the 1st and 2nd century, were keeping Rosh Hashanah even on a Sunday. It wasn't forbidden back then. But now with the modern Jewish calendar, the Orthodox calendar, they will postpone it a day or however they can so that these holy days will land on certain days. Now, as I pointed out in my video teachings, that our Creator says to keep them on these days. He doesn't say anything about postponing or avoiding 48-hour Shabbats. We go back to Genesis, Bereshit, as we say in Hebrew 1:14. These are appointed times by Him, preordained, pre-existed, and foretold of, even going back over 2,000 years before the Jewish people. And so who are we to say that we have the authority to change what He has set in motion and what He has invited us out to on dates? He wants to have a date with you. A special, meaningful one. You know, He wants every day with you and with all of us. But just like we have anniversaries and birthdays, some of them have more meaning and more purpose to them, and they're to be kept in a special way, special, meaningful, memorial way. And we also have rehearsals of future things that are very special to us. We have wedding rehearsals. And so if He invites you to a wedding rehearsal, are you going to say, well, that day isn't good or convenient, so I'm gonna keep, how about a day later? How about your weekly Shabbats? Well, what's wrong with Sunday? It's just a day difference. Well, are we being hypocritical by judging other people who are keeping Shabbats a day or more off from what the Scriptures say, and yet we are doing it ourselves in other ways with the annual Shabbats? How does He look at that? Let's get in alignment with Him. Okay? We get in alignment with Him, things will go smoother for us. Things will go, He will reveal more to us. He will use us more powerfully because we will be walking in His power. His power, His Ruach, Hochadesh, as we say, the Holy Spirit, will have more influence, more power in our lives as we become more in alignment with Him. It's not about trying to earn salvation or eternal life. I'm not saying we can earn that. We've all sinned and we all are worthy of death. We need salvation through grace, of course. But in trying to become like Him, to go to the dates that He invites us to with special meaning, we got to be careful not to do away with those things. Another thing that's been added, point number 2 that was added to the modern calendar, the Jewish Orthodox calendar today, is 19-year time cycles. They didn't exist prior to the 4th century. Okay? Even the Encyclopedia Judaica confesses and admits this. It was based upon agricultural conditions determining, they had to keep the feasts. They were agricultural feasts. And so if the lights in the firmament were matching up, but then they didn't have enough barley, they would postpone it a month. They had to go by the Scriptures, as I pointed out in my other video teachings. And so we need to understand those Scriptures. And see, that according to the 19-year time cycles, they'll add a 13th month on the year 3, on the 3rd year of this 19-year time cycle, every 19 years, the 6th year, the 8th year, the 11th year, the 14th year, the 17th year, and the 19th year. They'll add a 13th month. Now, these are just mathematically plugged in regardless of agriculture, regardless of the lights in the firmament and the equinoxes. And so it's a mathematical formula. Now, it can be 1 or 2 days off. About 40% of the time, because of their postponement rules I mentioned, it will line up with the actual times, the appointed times in the Scriptures. But most of the time, it's 1 or 2 days off, sometimes a whole month off. Very rarely, about once every decade or two.